Grace and peace to you in the name of God the Creator, Christ the Redeemer, and the Spirit who sustains us. Amen. I'm always intrigued when the preaching text starts the way ours does today. After this, therefore, the next day. These are all cues that whatever came before the text is really important to the story. And if I've said it once, I've said it 100 times, context matters. So when a text starts after these events, like ours does today, it's important to ask, after what events? The first 11 chapters or so of Genesis are what I have heard some commentators call the primordial prologue of the Bible. That's where all of the creation and recreation and re-recreation happens. We get the two creation stories and the rebellion against God in the garden, which we explored last week. We get the story of Cain and Abel and the birth of Adam and Eve's third child, Seth. There's some genealogy that gets us to Noah and his sons. Then there's the story of the flood and the ark and God recreating creation with Noah and his family and the animals that were saved. Then there's more genealogy after Noah's children. And then we get to chapter 11, in which all of the people of the earth speak the same language and decide to build a tower to heaven, which God destroys, then fractures the people into many peoples. God gives them different languages and spreads them all over the earth. After that, we get to Abram's story in chapter 12 and to the beginning of God's promises to what will become the people of Israel. The first few verses of chapter 12 are really important, although they're not part of the lectionary cycle for this year, so I want to read them to you, but we won't spend a lot of time with them. God said to Abram, "Leave your country, your people, and the home of your parents, and go to a place I will show you. I will make of you a great people. I will bless you and make your name so great that it will be used in blessings. I will bless those who bless you, and I will curse those who curse you. And all the people on the face of the earth will be blessed through you." Abram, who was 75 years old when he left Haran, began the journey as God had instructed, and his nephew Lot went with him. Abram took Sarai, his spouse, Lot, all their possessions, and all the dependents they acquired in Haran, and set out for Canaan. God appeared to Abram and said, "I will give this land to your descendants." Abram built an altar where God appeared to him. Here we have the threefold promise that God gives to Abram, the promise of blessing, the promise of many descendants, and the promise of land. And in response to God's promise, Abram, Sarai, and their household travel about 300 miles to the land God has given them. Abram and Sarai and Lot and his family go to Egypt to avoid a famine and return to Canaan when the famine is over. Eventually, Lot and Abram go their separate ways. Abram and Lot have become rich, but they're itinerant cattle herders, not powerful rulers. When they get in the way of a battle that's being fought over the valley where they've settled, Lot and his family are captured. Abram hears about it and goes to join the battle and free his nephew, which they succeed in doing. The ruler of Sodom, on whose side Abram had fought, offers him spoils of war. But Abram refuses because of his loyalty to God. It's a lot of context, but I think it's really important for understanding what has been going on in Abram's life that lead up to these three little words, "after these events." God has made promises to Abram, and Abram has followed where God has led. And now God appears before Abram in a vision and says, "What you're about to hear is great news. I know you were just offered a reward by the ruler of Sodom for helping him win his war, and I know you turned him down. I've got something even better planned." Not surprisingly, Abram's a little frustrated with God. It's been years since God made Abram these promises, long enough for him and his household to move halfway across the known world, long enough for them to go the rest of the way across the known world to survive a famine and come back, long enough to amass a fortune in livestock. And it is impossible to be the ancestor of a great nation if you don't even have one child. There's a first step in there that hasn't happened yet. Abram and Sarai, not getting any younger, probably expected this promise to be made real immediately, if not sooner. After all, Abram was 75 years old when God made these promises, and Sarai wasn't much younger. So he's understandably a little frustrated with God. And so he argues with God. What good are all these blessings? What good is your reward if I don't have any children like you promised me? He's already left his family to go to a new place on the strength of God's promises, promises which are probably starting to feel a little hollow. After all, without children, Abram is as good as dead. In the ancient world, before any sort of belief in afterlife or resurrection, there was only one way to live on after your death, and that was to pass your family name and the story of your life and your wealth to the next generation so that they could carry on in your tradition. Children were the ones who cared for parents in their old age. We talk about people of my generation being the sandwich generation now, taking care of aging parents at the same time that we're raising children. But there are resources that are available to us now that weren't available 5,000 years ago. Things like pensions and 401ks and long-term care insurance. In Abram and Sarai's day, when one generation became too old to work, they passed the work, the property, everything on to the next generation who were expected to take care of them. But when your only heir was a servant or retainer in your household, what guarantee did you have that their loyalty would lie with you? It must have felt to Abram and Sarai like their hope was being mocked. They heard, or thought they heard, God promising them that all the world would be blessed through them. And now, years later, those promises have yet to come true. Have you ever felt that way? Like you're waiting for God to keep their promises in your life. Like your prayers have not been answered. Your hopes have been dashed. It can feel for some like a kind of resignedness, a feeling like, okay, I guess this isn't what I had hoped for my life, but this is what I have. Or for some, it can feel like a deep despair. We probably have all had times in our life of faith where we have felt unable to hope. But here's the thing. God is still God. God is still at work even when we can't sense it. And then something happens. Maybe it's a glimpse of the night sky like it was for Abram. Maybe it's a word of encouragement from someone important in your life of faith, or a Bible verse or a hymn that hits differently, and all of a sudden we feel a flame of hope rekindled. And we remember there's a difference between God hasn't done it and God hasn't done it yet. There's such power in that little word, yet. The door is still open. Hope is not extinguished. God does not forget their promises to us. As followers of Christ, we are believers in yet. We know what it means to have experienced God's promises and God's faithfulness and still be awaiting the fullness of those promises. We remember those promises and experience them anew when we remember our baptisms. We remember those promises and experience them anew when our relationships with each other are strengthened, when new layers of meaning are added to them. We remember those promises and experience them anew when we forgive one another, when we are forgiven, when we work together for a common goal, when we delight in the beauty of God's creation. we get to celebrate the yet in a very special way in just a few minutes. When Kimberly asked her mom when she was baptized, she discovered that she had not been. She is no less a child of God. She is no less a beloved and cherished member of our community. She is no less a follower of Christ. And yet, today, another layer of meaning will be added to our relationships with each other as followers of Christ as we rejoice with her in her baptism. When God reiterates their promise to Abram under the stars, in the beauty of creation where anything seems possible, Abram believes God, and God accounts it to Abram as righteousness. God makes a formal declaration that the offering of Abram's faith is acceptable, that Abram is engaged in the active work of doing faith and practicing justice in his relationship with God. How are we accounting to God while we wait for God's next move? How are we practicing righteousness? And how do we experience God's righteousness while we wait for the yet? While we wait for what seems possible, seems impossible, but we know is possible in God's reign. Amen.